Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In this introductory lecture, we will introduce some of the fundamental concepts which went into the development of this course. This radical course rejects the entire line of development based on the ideas of Sir Ronald Fisher, who founded this discipline in the early 20th century. Instead, we will rebuild the entire subject on new foundations, motivated and based on an Islamic approach to knowledge. Islam teaches us that the worth of actions depends on the intentions, so we must focus on why we are studying statistics and answer this question first. And in Islam, there is only one goal, and that is to succeed on the Day of Judgment. So the issue becomes, how can we study statistics in such a way that it will help us to succeed on the Day of Judgment? Another way to say the same thing is to note that we are created only for worship. And so the question is, how can we study statistics so that it becomes an act of worship, so that the ink that we use to write our lecture notes becomes equivalent in worth to the blood of the martyrs? So the first thing we need to do in order to achieve this goal is to understand the distinction between useful and useless knowledge. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked Allah Ta'ala to increase him in useful knowledge and also asked for protection from useless knowledge. So we must first decide whether this knowledge that we are studying, statistics, whether this is useful or not. The Quran gives the examples of two angels who were given some knowledge which was harmful, and they taught it to people while warning them that this is not of any good and this is not useful and it will not benefit you. But people acquired this knowledge anyway and used it to cause harm to others and ultimately to themselves. So some types of knowledge are fitna and harmful, other types of knowledge are good and useful. And before we study statistics as an act of worship, we must decide which category this knowledge belongs to. How can we tell whether modern statistics is useful knowledge or useless knowledge? Well, one way to do it is to think about the intentions with which it was created. Now, it turns out that Sir Ronald Fisher was a eugenist. He was trying to create a world, improve the humanity by breeding the superior races and making them grow, and exterminating or eliminating the inferior races. He himself considered himself to be a superior and had 6 or 7 children in order to further the goal of increasing the good races. So did this toxic intention, the racist intention, affect the development of the statistics? So the vast majority of people believe that the answer is no, even though Fisher had a vile intention in his studying the correlation between the heights of fathers and the sons to prove that IQ or intelligence is inherited, and so the superior races remain superior by genetics. Even though this is a vile intention, the methods he developed are neutral and they can be used for good or bad purposes. So the techniques are not influenced by the intentions. Our contention in this course is no, this is not true. The techniques that were developed were actually shaped by these evil intentions, and they are themselves corrupt and useless. And two of the main difficulties with modern statistics is that the failure to distinguish between correlation and causation. This is actually a deep problem in Western philosophy, which started with Sir David Hume, who confused the two, and philosophers have never recovered from this confusion. So Fisher himself was also deceived and deluded on this matter, and he could not differentiate them, while it is crucial to differentiate the two if you want to study how numbers are to be used to make inference. The second problem is that Fisher did not have access to high-powered computing machines, and so he developed an approach which involved reducing the data to a few numbers which would summarize all the information in the data. But this cannot actually be done, and so Fisher resorted to making artificial assumption which allows this reduction. Now, the fact of the matter is that this assumption is nearly always false. It was introduced by Fisher only to avoid the problem of not having computers around. Now, even though these assumptions that Fisher introduced can be abandoned, they have become so deeply embedded into the foundations of statistics that they continue to be used in modern textbooks all over the world without any realization that these assumptions are no longer necessary now that we have the computer power required to do without them. There is a deeper problem inherent in the entire structure of knowledge created by European intellectuals over the past few centuries, and we can only very, very briefly hint at this problem. And the problem arose because there was a century of extremely destructive and violent religious warfare between Protestants and Catholics, and this forced the Europeans to develop ways of life, develop thinking about ways of life, namely politics, economics, social institutions, which were not based on religion, because religion seemed to lead to perpetual warfare. So, because of this experience, the Europeans developed an approach to thinking about politics, economics, and social institutions, which apparently does not rely on any moral foundations. It seems to be objective and rational, but in fact, no useful human knowledge can be developed without moral foundations. So what happens as a result is that these moral foundations are concealed and hidden because they could not be brought to light by European intellectuals, because if they did, then they would get embroiled in religious controversy. So they developed this method to conceal morality and normative judgments without open discussion. And this is a deadly problem for today, because the entire stock of knowledge is built on these toxic moral foundations which were introduced without any explicit knowledge or consideration. Our focus in this lecture will be purely on the social sciences, which tell us how to live our lives, apparently on objective and rational basis, but actually on the basis of toxic moral foundations. The physical sciences are also affected by these same toxic moral foundations, but they are entirely different in character and nature. They actually provide power. The problem with the physical sciences is that they were developed in order to help people pursue power and profits and pleasure, and this drive for immoral purposes has vastly influenced the nature of the developments in science and technology. And so there is knowledge in the physical sciences, but it has been developed for evil purposes, and it is used for evil purposes with the coming climate crisis, which threatens the future of mankind on the planet, as just one example. Social science is entirely different from the physical sciences. Here, social science is not knowledge at all. It is a dictation about how we should lead our lives, and so it's actually a religion, but it is labeled with this misleading name of science, and this is a deception which has managed to fool the world. So instead of proving this claim on the deep grounds that it has been made, we will just provide an illustrative examples, and we will look at statistics as an example of how the wrong moral foundations led to the development of the wrong subject, and we will reject this entire discipline as it has developed over the past century, and we will rebuild on new foundations to illustrate how our approach to rebuilding knowledge works. In particular, from the very start, statistics will be thought of, will be defined as the art of making arguments with numbers, how to persuade people using numbers. So this is a rather different conception of statistics from the one that is common in conventional textbooks based on the approach created by Fisher. Superficially, it seems as if statistics will not be affected whether we take an Islamic approach or not. After all, 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, whether you are an atheist or a Christian or a Muslim. But what we will like to argue in this course later, that statistics is not like that. It pretends to be objective, like 2 plus 2 equals 4, but it is more along the lines of a joke. When somebody asked, what is 2 plus 2? And the response was, well, whether are you buying or selling? So statistics modifies the numbers in accordance with and reinterprets the numbers in accordance with hidden motivations. And that's what makes statistics very disturbing and damaging. And that's why the most widely sold statistics textbook of all time is entitled How to Lie with Statistics. We make some concluding remarks for this introductory lecture. Some of the key defects in the Fisherian approach, which is widespread, being taught all over the world today, is the idea that we can study numbers in isolation. We don't need to understand where the numbers come from. We can just look at the numbers themselves. The idea is that statistician will analyze the numbers and provide the results, and the field expert, the politician or the economist who produce these numbers, will take the analysis and apply it in his real world. But the key realization that is produced by thinking about it from an Islamic perspective is that you cannot separate the theory and the practice. Since our goal is to produce useful knowledge, we cannot look at numbers in isolation. We have to look at how these numbers are going to be used in the real world context. Once you start looking at the relationship between the numbers and reality, you realize that numbers haven't come up out of nowhere. People have measured things because they had certain goals. They did not measure other things because they did not want them to be known. So once you look at the real world context, instead of taking the numbers for granted as given and not going beyond, then immediately normative and moral considerations come into the picture. What is the argument that is being made with these numbers? Why are people trying to make this argument? And will this argument have good or bad effects? All of these questions, which are not part of conventional statistics, become of central importance in an Islamic approach. There was a debate in economics which took place some time ago, which discusses this issue. Can we measure things without having any theory behind it? So basically, the conclusion is that you cannot, because the theory tells us what are the things worth measuring, how they should be measured, what the measurements mean, and how we should use analysis based on these measurements to guide our policy actions. These issues, which have to do a lot with not just the numbers, but the relationship between the numbers and the real world context in which these numbers are being used to debate and to discuss the different policy actions available, this must be done in integrated fashion. We cannot measure things without a theory which tells us what is worth measuring and what is not. So this course is a proof of a concept. The concept is that moral foundations are critical for construction of useful knowledge. The entire Western secular modern tradition denies this fundamental idea. They say that knowledge must be built without moral foundation, that morality itself is not part of knowledge at all. So even though they claim to have a constructed knowledge which has no moral foundations, the reality is that if you look carefully, you find that it is built on toxic moral foundations. This leads to the necessity of rebuilding the entire stock of Western knowledge on sound moral foundations, provided by Islam. Now this is a huge task, and proving this argument and explaining it is also a huge task. So instead of doing that, we are providing an example in this course. So in this course we will explain how conventional statistics is used to deceive people into thinking that numbers provide objective judgments when in fact they are built on moral and normative principles. And we will show how to rebuild the entire discipline on new foundations which avoid this problem.